Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College. We have reached the point in the semester at which we are able to shift gears and do something that is both fun and, I think, very practical for all of us. Dean Weil and I preside over the majority of the honors theses that are defended, and we select from among those theses ones that we think are good representative theses. We try to select theses from different disciplines, and we invite students to come and talk not only about the research that they've done, but also about their experiences, and we ask them to pass on any words of advice that they might have for you. So at this time, I'm going to ask Dean Weil to take over and introduce our speakers.
Okay, I'm going to do them in reverse order of presentation. We have two today. Our second will be Sarah-Wilfong-Joblin, who's sitting right over there. She's majoring in violin performance and did a thesis called Orchestrating a Carillon, Initiating a Folk Composer into the Baroque World. It was written under the supervision of Dr. Carol Neese. She's an honors transfer fellow, a Eureka recipient, and has already been accepted and will start graduate school here in music this spring. She's been a fiddle player, an arranger, a recording studio session player, and is a proud mother of two adorable, inquisitive, and energetic girls, Kyra and Evelyn. So she'll be our second speaker, and I think has some video for us. I got to see the concert that she participated in a week or so ago. Very nice. And then our second is a little bit more, but our first speaker is a little bit more traditional thesis, albeit a little bit on the lengthy side. I've already told him, you know, everybody doesn't have to write a thesis as long as his, but James Morton, who's also sitting here on the side, is double majoring in history and political science, and wrote a thesis called Church versus State from Confessionalism to Judicial Interpretation in Everson versus Board of Education. His advisor was Dr. Jennifer Woodward in the political science department, and he is hoping also to apply for graduate school and eventually get a PhD. So we're going to start with Mr. Morton, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so it's a very ostentatious sounding title. The concept here was to look at Everson v. Board of Education and see if the justices were interpreting what they drew on from James Madison in light of Madison's context, in light of what he understood from history, his interpretation of historical events, of Enlightenment authors, everything that made up James Madison, and why he would have included the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. The genesis for the project was that church and state was my father's passion. He was never able to finish his PhD, and I decided to follow in his footsteps and pursue that. When I began the process, I had a very specific thought in mind that this was about primarily about violence, and the violence of like the English Reformation, when Mary I was burning 350 people at the stake, and that Madison and others of the founding fathers were looking back at this and seeing that violence and saying, we don't want that here. And that was what they were primarily looking at. Once I began doing the research, I found that that was not quite the case. James Madison was primarily interested in liberty. It was his passion, and the religious liberty was part of that. He felt that the Republican form of government was the best way to achieve that, and that faction was the biggest enemy to that. So Madison drew a lot of his views from the Enlightenment authors. He studied the Reformation. He studied a lot of the ancient civilizations. And it was through all that that he formulated his opinions. What I looked at in Everson was that the justices failed to take into account, what Madison's motivators were, and that in the process of doing that, they conclude partly that the Establishment Clause is about protecting the state from the church, not vice versa. There is an element of protecting the state, and that element is more about the fact that if you look back at Reformation history, you'll find that every time the state became a player in the game, in other words, they were deciding, all right, for our territory, we're all going to be Catholic, that almost always engendered violence, and that violence would eventually destabilize the local government and cause things to either flip or in some way create a situation where the government would not survive. And I think that was part of Madison's concerns. If you really start to look at, the things that he's writing, he's really concerned that he's got a young government, they're trying to get consensus, they don't need a lot of issues with violence created by the fact that the government is deciding for everybody who's going to be Catholic or Protestant or Lutheran or whatever. What I really wanted to talk to you today, though, is about the process that I went through in creating this thesis. So let's start out with this. Don't bite off more than you can chew. The very first thought that I had, I was shooting for around 70 pages on this. That's what I wanted to hit. And I was going to bring in 3 or 4 founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. I had picked several that I wanted to look at. I was going to look at a number of different documents. I knew I wanted to look at the Reformation. I wanted to look at the Enlightenment. And both of my advisors and Dr. Weil all kind of pulled on the reins and said, whoa there, you're aiming too big. And I really had to bring the focus down, and which was very difficult for me because all of this is so interesting to me. At some point in this project, I had hit over 150 pages of writing. When they told me that I could only have one founding father and one document, my first thought was, how in the world am I going to write 70 pages on one founding father and one document? I thought, I can't do it. Now I look at it and go, how can I keep from writing 150 pages on one founding father and one document? So I think part of the process is you really need to narrow your focus and think, what is it that I really, really want to get to here? What do I want to focus on? What's my primary purpose for writing this or doing this research? And I think that was, for me, that's always difficult because tend to be a little verbose anyway. The second part of the process for me was that the whole project changed. And this is going to happen no matter what kind of project you're doing. You're going to begin your research and you're going to find out that part of what you thought you were going to do is not true, or your research is leaning in a different direction. When I started this, I really wanted to make it both the political science side in analyzing the Supreme Court case, and I wanted to deal with the historical aspects as foundation. And as I got deeper and deeper into it, I went more and more into the history side of it till I almost lost the political science side. So just understand that going into this, no matter what you start with, your process of research is going to make that change. And you're going to find that things that you thought when you began, like I thought about the violence, end up not being really the focus. And just flow with the changes. Just go with it, see where it goes. And watch out for rabbit holes. I found so many rabbit holes. I spent a little time talking to Dr. Lynn Nelson in the history department about the Founding Fathers. And he suggested, 7 or 8 things that I could look at. And every time I started opening one of those things and looking at it, I found 6 other things that I could look at. And I ended up in so many rabbit holes that Dr. Woodward was getting a little frustrated with me because I'd write all this stuff. I started out with the Reformation on this, and the Reformation went about 50 pages. And when she looked at it, she said, well, this is a nice thesis for a master's for the Reformation, but you're losing your whole point of Everson. And so I really needed to back off. I think I in the end, pulled the Reformation down to 20 pages. So overall, I deleted about a third of what I had written. One of the quotes that I have up here on the screen is, Martin Luther loved a good bonfire. In the process of the Reformation, I went a lot into the history of Martin Luther and how the Reformation happened. And my second reader on this is Dr. Sutherland from the history department. And when she looked at it, she said, this really isn't your focus. Your focus is about how the violence and how the state reacted to the violence and state building came out of that. She said, you don't need to talk about Martin Luther at all, other than to maybe mention his name. So there's rabbit holes all over the place in your research, and you really need to identify, have a good, strong idea of what your thesis is, so that when you start writing something, you can go, oh, does this really fit in with what my thesis is or not? Time management. I have terrible time management. I can't tell you how many times I sat down to write at the computer and my brain would just shut off and I'd fall asleep right at my computer. Once in a while that was advantageous because I'd wake up later and see what I'd written and went, actually sounds pretty good, but I don't remember writing it. I was forever missing deadlines, and that also frustrated both my advisor and my second reader, because both of them, remember that they're teachers, they also have time issues. They have a lot of stuff that they have to do. So if they had planned on their calendar to look at my first chapter draft on September 15th, and I don't get it to them until September 30th, that messes up their schedule too. So you kind of have to keep them in mind as well. And when I sat down and planned out my calendar, I never thought about things like, hey, there's going to be midterms and all my teachers are going to want projects due either at midterms or at the end of this. I didn't take any of that into account when I created my original time schedule. And I missed every single deadline except the one to get it to the Honors College. It was the only one I made. And then, talk to your advisor. Keep in constant contact. Because a lot of the stuff that I went through, if I had just sat down and talked with my advisor about it before I did it, I could have avoided it. If I had talked to them about where I was thinking as far as research and the Reformation, they would have pulled back from that immediately. There was a couple times they let me run with things, and I think it was just to see where I would go with it. And then once I got there, they kind of said, all right, we let you kind of go on this, but you need to get back to where your focus is. So I think it's very important to keep constant communication with your advisor. If you're going to miss a deadline, explain to them why you're missing the deadline. Like the first deadline I missed by about 3 months. And that was because I just got stuck in the Reformation. I couldn't find a way out of it. If I had talked to my history advisor on it, she would have said, which she eventually did say, James Madison is your primary focus. Why don't you do him first? And then see where the Reformation takes you after that. I was thinking chronologically. I went to the Reformation first, then came to Madison. If I had flipped it over, I would have avoided most of what I went through. And then finally, don't give up. I can't tell you how many emotions I went through doing this. There were times I wanted to throw my computer out the window, burn all the library books that I had. There was actually days I cried over this. There was days of euphoria when I actually got something turned in, and then immediate despondency when they came back with all the revisions they wanted. I went through every emotion there was. I learned a lot about myself in the process. I learned that I was not good with time management. I learned that what I was doing for taking care of my sources was not working. What worked on a 10-page paper is not going to work on. I ended up with about 100 pages of my writing on this. And my source management did not work at all, especially when it came time. When I revised the Reformation chapter, I used the term ibid a lot. So I would put the source and then the next 5 or 6 things would be connected to that with the word ibid. Well, when they said, we want you to take this part out, I went through and very merrily just delete, 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 and then read over it for readability and looked down and realized that the quotation I was looking at was not connected to the right book. And I went, uh-oh, because I've got now 20 pages, what was originally 45, now 20 pages, and all of my references, all of my sources are messed up. It took me 3.5 days to fix it. And fortunately, I had saved, that's something I will say, at every step. When you begin a new process of editing or revisions or whatever, save it as a new copy, because it's the only thing that saved me. It would have taken me weeks to go back and find all that in the books if I'd had to do it that way. At least I had the old copy and I could go back and find the quote in the old copy and then see where it was supposed to be connected. But it was a mess, and it was a learning process. So I would say that's what this whole thing is. It's a learning process, that you go through this and it teaches you some things about yourself and about how to research, and in the end, it's worth it. So, and I think that's all I got.
Hi, everybody. So, show of hands, who is currently feverishly working on a thesis? All right, who has defended this semester? Woohoo, congrats.
Who should be feverishly working on it?
That's an even better question, yes. So, I really loved the graphic of the caterpillar and the butterfly. The idea that your thesis will change, yes, absolutely. Although I think rather than a caterpillar to a butterfly, mine looked more like some weird corkscrew squiggle thing from start to finish. And I would second what James said. Know that that's pretty normal. Although there may be the rare person who has an idea and is able to pull it to completion magically in a straight line. But I think you're in the minority. I wanted to take a moment and say how fortunate I feel to be an honors transfer fellow, because I wouldn't have known about the honors thesis program if I hadn't gained the fellowship. And what a sad loss that would have been. I wouldn't have been absolutely crazy this last year. What would I have been doing with myself? No, seriously, writing a thesis has been really fulfilling, and I can say that from the other side now. So live in hope that you too can say nice platitudes about it once it's done and you have a shiny copy in your hand. I want to give you a little overview of my project and kind of outline the curves of my journey along the way. It sounds a little bit like the beginning of a Harry Potter novel, but it all began on my 11th birthday. I grew up as a violinist. I started when I was 3, and I always considered myself to be very serious about it. I grew up in a very hippie, folksy family who listened to a lot of folk music and jazz, but I wanted none of that nonsense. It was Tchaikovsky or bust, people. On my 11th birthday, a friend of my parents gave me an album by a group called The Chieftains. I was skeptical, but I listened to it, and it was actually pretty cool. It was Irish folk music, traditional stuff, but the tunes that really resonated with me were ones written by a fellow named Turlough O'Carolan. I actually liked them enough that I decided to learn how to play them on violin. And then I looked up some more because they were pretty neat, so maybe it would be nice to learn other ones. And before I knew it, I had been sucked down one of those rabbit holes into the land of fiddle tunes, and I can actually draw a straight line for myself between hearing O'Carolan for the first time and having a career as a professional touring fiddle player. But fast forward to last fall, when I was sitting in my transfer seminar class. That's where we all get kind of the condensed version of, here's what a thesis can be. Here's a couple of options for how to go about doing it. Go find yourself an advisor and have fun. I had this great, brilliant research idea. I was going to look at violinists before and after engaging in aerobic exercise and measure the precision of their pitch when they played, how in tune they were. I thought this, could be revolutionary. If we all ran around the block before we practiced, we'll be great. I had a little start to a bibliography. I was getting ready to write for IRB approval. I was crossing my fingers I could actually do this. At the same time, I was playing a Corelli piece. Arcangelo Corelli is one of the great Baroque composers, Baroque in music, meaning the period between 1600 and 1750. And I was in the practice room one day, practicing my Corelli like a good music student. I will play you a little snippet of the piece I was practicing. And while I was practicing it, I had another piece of music pop into my mind. And it was this random O'Carrollin tune that I'd learned a long time ago, a number of years ago. And it went like this. And I thought, they're different, but they're actually not dissimilar. That's kind of interesting. So I pulled out my phone and I looked up O'Carrollin's dates because I was curious. And his dates were 1670 to 1738, which sticks him in the Middle Baroque era, which is oddly where Corelli resides. But O'Carrollin is this blind, uneducated Irish harpist who made his living wandering from town to town and writing folk tunes for the Irish aristocracy. Like, surely he's not a Baroque composer. That's just crazy talk. But, I mean, maybe he could be. I don't know. I guess I should look it up. It was at that very moment that I felt this crushing weight on my conscience. This was frivolous research. I had a thesis to write. I needed to focus. Now, I don't know about you, but I am never more creative, curious, or engaged than when I have a deadline for something else. It sounds like this may not be just me. So anyway, I pushed away the Corelli-O'Carrollin idea for a while. But after a couple of days where I couldn't think of anything else, I decided to cave and just read one article and see if I could satisfy my curiosity. I got about 4 pages in before I had the sinking feeling that I really needed to rethink my thesis project. Oh boy. It turns out that the answer to my question, was O'Carrollin a Baroque composer, was both no and yes. He wasn't a trained musician, but he had good instincts. And because he was traveling in rather rare circles in Ireland, writing music for the rich lords and ladies, he came in contact with all of the trendiest music of the time, stuff from Europe by people like Vivaldi and Gemignani and Corelli. In fact, one of O'Carrollin's friends, a man named Charles O'Connor, and this is as quoted by William Grattan Flood, who's a musicologist, wrote that the Italian compositions O'Carrollin preferred to all others and was enraptured with Corelli's music. So perhaps there actually was a connection. Maybe O'Carrollin was writing musical love letters to Corelli. Wouldn't that be sweet? So this was all very interesting, but what the heck am I supposed to do with it? I settled on deciding I was going to orchestrate one of O'Carrollin's pieces in the style of Corelli, because that seems like a good idea. I was going to use the Concerto Grosso form, which for the non-music majors in the room means a form that was popular during the Baroque era that utilized a small chamber orchestra and a group of soloists. And they kind of play back and forth for a while, and then they play together, and it's very lovely. And it was a style that was utilized by Corelli extensively. So extensively, in fact, that his entire Opus 6 consists of 12 concerti grossi, which I listened to ad nauseum. My hope was to accomplish 2 things with this. 1, to establish a link between O'Carrollin and Corelli, and 2, to give sort of a posthumous wish fulfillment to O'Carrollin, sorry. Because although he wrote all of these beautiful and enduring melodies, and he wrote over 200 of them, he wrote only melodies, which is really interesting because we think of musicians and we think of rhythm and harmony and melody all working together. But he never wrote anything for more than a single instrument. So the next goal was to set out to learn the ways of Corelli, as one does. Studying Corelli was actually pretty fun because I've played some of his music since I was a kid. But listening to all of those concerti grossi on repeat, I realized that I had no idea what I was looking for, which might also be a common feeling no matter your discipline. It took a while, but eventually patterns started emerging, and that was the part where I needed to keep the faith that my subconscious actually would do its job and help me see the patterns I needed to see. Eventually, I had a list compiled of nice little things that Corelli did over and over again in his various concertos that I could utilize in my piece. So it became time to start composing. And I'll be darned if O'Carolan didn't want to cooperate. He's a very stubborn man. At some points, I felt like I had the ghosts of Corelli and O'Carolan sitting on my shoulders and having an argument over the top of my head. Corelli would say something like, "Good gracious, man, you can't go to the flat 7 again. You've already done that 6 times in this movement alone. The audience is going to throw tomatoes at you. Just stop it already." And O'Carolan would say, "Neener, neener, you old windbag, it's my piece. I can do what I like. Keep the flat 7, girlie." Eventually, we came to some compromises. We kept all of O'Carolan's original notes. That made him happy. But we smoothed some things to keep Corelli's desire for orderly phrasing in line. But it took a lot of work. And when that was done, I had the rather depressing realization that completing my thesis project did not mean I had completed my thesis. Because doing a thing is a lot easier than writing about doing a thing. Yes, I see the heads nodding. But the weeks of writing and revising were actually punctuated by some pleasant things and some not so pleasant things. The excitement of sitting through the first rehearsal and hearing my piece come to life with the MTSU Chamber Orchestra, and the dismay of having my thesis advisor say 3 weeks before my deadline, "Hey, you know that harpsichord part I said you didn't need to write? I've changed my mind. You need to write a harpsichord part now." Well, I had plans for this weekend, but I guess I'm writing a harpsichord part instead. All right. And then elation when I handed it in, and she pronounced it to be kick-ass. So that was something. Everything got turned in on time, and I was relieved. Fast forward to the defense, and Dean Weil asked me a really interesting question. He asked if there was anything that I would do differently if I were to do this again. And in the defense, I thought about it for a moment and said, no, I don't think so. And as I've continued to mull that over, I've come to the conclusion, well, I'd probably give myself an additional 2 weeks to fight with Microsoft Word for formatting at the end. So I'd add that to your wonderful list of things that you should do. Allow way more time than you think you need for formatting because it's terrible. But other than that, honestly, no. For all that I arrived at the place that I did via a very circuitous route, I'm not sure it could have happened any other way. If I could go back in time and whisper this O'Carolan Corelli idea to myself during the first week of seminar class, I'm not sure that it would have grabbed my imagination in the same way. Perhaps that only happened because I was thinking about something else at the time. I really truly believe that we get a multitude of good ideas in our lifetimes, and our job is to recognize them and kind of pull them in and plant them in a little garden and watch them grow. And the trick is that we're not always given our good ideas in the order that we should execute them. And that's where learning to watch and see which ones need more cultivation and which ones need pruning and which ones, okay, let's be honest, they're really weeds. Go pull them and chuck them in the bin. But the greatest challenge and the biggest reward of this thesis experience has been recognizing that I have many ideas that are worthy. And I don't have to execute them all at the same time, but I can watch them grow and take a lot of pride in the ones that reach their full potential. So, to finish off here, what I'd like to do is actually remind you of what that beginning phrase of the O Carolyn piece sounds like without any orchestration, and then I'm going to play you the last half of the piece fully orchestrated. So that turns into this.
playing in that as well?
Yes, I was one of the soloists.
Okay, I couldn't see from this angle. So you wrote that whole piece yourself? Sort of?
I took the melody and what I did was I orchestrated it for all the other instruments and took pieces of the melody and put them in different voices so that it created kind of a cohesive whole.
And the original was actually written for a harp, right? You're playing on a violin.
Yes.
I'm actually condensing a larger piece for ensemble as my thesis. How many rehearsals did you plan with everybody to put it together?
Well, we did it as part of the chamber orchestra ensemble, so there were rehearsals already scheduled in. We probably got 6-ish.
Let me ask you, you talked about formatting thesis. Did you wait and do that afterwards?
I did some formatting as I went, but figuring out how to do the front matter and different types of page numbers, I cried over page numbers.
I did too, actually, but, and I'll throw this out as a suggestion to you guys. I set all of that up in advance. I sat down and hacked it out and figured it out with a blank document rather than waiting until I had all of my material written. And then once I had the formatting figured out, then I just went back and, wrote in each section. But I had like chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, the front matter, the bibliography, all that was set up ahead of time, just blank of material. And that, I think, saved me in the long run a lot of effort, because I've discovered, I'll throw this one out. In the process of doing this, at one point, I inadvertently clicked something within Microsoft Word, and all of the blank material at the end of pages or between pages disappeared. And I went, uh-oh, what have I done? So I had just started a new copy, so I went, well, I'll just go back and get the old one, and I haven't written that much, we'll just do it again. I opened up the old one, it was the same way. I went, uh-oh, I've really messed up now. I couldn't figure out, I looked online, I couldn't find anything on the internet about it. So I called Microsoft and said, help, what do I do? And she laughed. And I went, that doesn't comfort me much. And she said, can you give me control of your computer? I said, yes. And she sent me an email. I clicked the link. She opened up the document, went click, click, and fixed it. And I went, what did you do? Well, apparently there's a thing that deletes all that extraneous space, and you have to find a place where you can click between pages, which is either at the beginning of the document or the end. And she just went to where she could get the beginning of a page where she could actually touch on it, and clicked it twice, and it came back, and I'm like, it was very simple, but I had no clue what to do with it. I actually had to call and say, help! I do that a lot. I need an 8-year-old child around to help with computer issues, because I'm of an older generation.
Another question.
So what did you end up writing your thesis about? Were you talking about the process of writing it, or the rehearsals, or what?
It was in 2 sections. So I wrote a section that was kind of about the history of O'Carolan and going into why his life was interesting and extraordinary, given his background and the fact that he was prolific as he was and blinded at an older age. He was 18 and learned an instrument at that time and then turned out to be a professional musician. It kind of gave some background as to who he was. And then I wrote a section detailing what I extrapolated from listening to all of the Corelli scores and these different bullet points of Corelli used this, 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 and this over and over in his music. So clearly they're idiomatic of his orchestration, and here's how I applied them to my orchestration.
Did you get input from anyone else when you were arranging it?
I would get periodic input from my advisor, but she was relatively hands-off and did a lot more when she had a finished product to look at and would go, that's very medieval, let's fix that. But there weren't too many of those instances, actually.
And if I can just do this as a reminder, one of the reasons we had these two is they're trying to get sort of a traditional and then one that's, you know, a creative project. And we really welcome creative projects, whether it's, you know, art or music or whatever, but you do always need to remember if you're doing one of those that there's a written component to it. So just the performance, good as it was, may be acceptable in some places, but here it's accompanied by some written explanation. So if you're doing a creative, and we've had some great ones across disciplines, but we really want that kind of variety here, and we want you to feel at home, even if you're not in one of the, you know, traditional social science areas.
How did you had said that you had some time management issues, especially with such a large project. How did you work through that? In what ways did you think that you learned from that? And have you gotten better since, or yeah?
Well, my social life ended. I do mock trial as one of my classes, and I quite enjoy doing mock trial. And one of the things that my mock trial team does is they go out to Bar Louie's twice a week. I never got to go out with them but once. So, and I think they got really tired of hearing me say, I can't come out tonight, I'm working on my honors thesis. When I defended, the entire team came and sat with me. Sorry. But I think I got through it just because I'm bullheaded and I'm not going to give up. I'm very tenacious. I will not quit. And there were nights I literally did sit at my computer and say, I have to get something on paper, and would literally fall asleep at the computer, wake up a half an hour later and go, all right, you're not doing yourself any good. So I did learn that I have to sleep. I work overnights at Kroger, do school during the day, find some time to write on the thesis. And it was just a matter of, you know, my mother had what she called her drip method. My mother built stone walls around their house, one stone at a time, and she carried one a day and move it to where she wanted it. And I think I learned from her that trait of, you know, if you're going this way, carry a stone that way. If you're going back this way, take something with you. Don't make it a useless trip. So, you know, every time I sat down at the computer, I'm opening up, say, the Reformation, but I'm still thinking about James Madison, and just, you know, one piece at a time. You know, sometimes you have to break it down to, I need a page. I need a page tonight. And then I can go back later and say, all right, read it over. What could I do to fix this page? And there were nights when, you know, what I wrote came out incredible, and I read it later and go, did I write that? Was that me? And then there was times when I'd look at the page and it was absolute gibberish, but it was something I could fix. So it was just a matter of don't give up, don't quit. Just, you know, anytime you could slip 5 minutes in there to work on it, or pick up a book and read something and then put it down and say, is there any, you know, think about it for a while. Is there anything I can pull out of that?
So she kind of went into a little bit more detail about, you know, what inspired your thesis on it. And I know you'd mentioned that your dad was, you know, doing some church and state stuff, but what inspired the specific topic on church and state for your thesis?
All right, well, as a child, my father was a preacher. And at home, he was very quiet. He wouldn't say much. In fact, I told Dr. Bile I never had a conversation with my father, ever. Other than, you know, do this, do that. You know, I would go out and sit with him while he was working on his car. He never taught me how to take apart a carburetor or do a brake job. I would just be there and he'd be working on the car. But during the process of life, I was always listening to him. And one of the things where he would get very vocal was when there was something on the TV about church and state. And he would always say it out loud. I don't understand why they can't figure out that this is for the protection of the church, not the state. So I grew up with that around me. When I was in my teenage years, he attended Baylor University. And he thought he had a dispensation for them that at that point when you did your doctorate, when you were writing your dissertation, you could not hold a job. You were not allowed. He had 8 children. He couldn't not work. He had to hold a job. And he thought that they were going to excuse that in him, and when it came down to writing, they said no. And he was never able to finish his doctorate. Several days before he died, we had that conversation. And I just felt it was right to pick up where he left off, to finish it for him. And this was his passion, that this is about protection of the church. And I had to go through the process of looking at it and saying, is it really what my father thought? And after I got done writing the Reformation, I was talking to my sister up in New York, and she said, hey, you know, I have some of Dad's old papers from college. Would you like to read them? Well, sure. So she sent me down 5 or 6 papers. I haven't gotten through all of them yet, but the first one I picked up was Church and State. And I went, oh, and found out that he had gone to the same place in the Reformation I went, drew the same conclusion. And it was like 10 years after he's passed on, I finally have the conversation.
So for the sake of understanding your project, you've talked about the Reformation, you've talked about James Madison. What do you mean by protecting the church? Can you briefly say what you mean?
The whole idea of liberty in James Madison's mind is for the protection of the citizens. It's always about limiting the government and what the government can do. It's never been about limiting the people and what they can do. It's always been, when Madison wrote, he originally was not planning on writing a Bill of Rights. It wasn't on his radar. But a lot of people were insisting on a Bill of Rights because they were concerned about the fact that you're talking about a stronger central government. What they had with the Articles of the Confederation were not working. It was a weak government. It was not getting done what they wanted to get done. And I start my period with Madison with Shays' Rebellion, because that was the point at which I think people really realized we need to do something with this. Prior to that, there was a move on to create a constitution, to create a strong central government, but it wasn't until Shays' Rebellion that everybody kind of got on board. And in the process of trying to get the Constitution ratified, there were a lot of people who didn't want that strong central government and wanted some kind of protection put in there to protect the liberties of the people. If you're looking at it from the point of a social contract, we give up some of our rights to the government for the benefit of protecting the rest of our rights. We don't give up all of our rights, and you really want some kind of a protection that says to the government, you can go this far and no further. Madison draws heavily on the Enlightenment authors who talk about that our religious convictions were in place before there was a government. And so those things are outside the purview of the government. They pre-existed. And I think that's really where I'm going with protection. There is a protection of the state, but it's in the fact that if you keep everybody happy, they're not going to rise up and overthrow their own government. And that did happen a number of times during the Reformation. There were places where, and in fact at one point, all of the government people got thrown out the window of a castle. That was how they overthrew their government. So I think that's pretty much where I went on that.
Cool. That's just fine.
So you mentioned that before you focused in on James Madison, you started out writing about several other founding fathers. So what was your kind of original scope for this project, and how did you narrow it down, or why did you narrow it down to James Madison?
I started out with, I was going to do James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton. And I narrowed it down because Dr. Weil told me I had to. James Madison was the author of the Bill of Rights, so he was the most important of the three. Jefferson also had a lot of strong opinions on religion. And I threw Hamilton in there just because he had worked with Madison on the Federalist Papers. And at the point that I did the proposal, I had the wrong idea totally about the proposal meeting. I thought that was more about, I'm just going to throw the ideas out there, and then they're going to say, okay, go ahead, follow them. And I really was not as prepared as I should have been for my proposal meeting. And I think in the long run that cost me a little bit of time. I was a little discouraged after the meeting that, on top of that, I had not slept for 2 days prior to having that meeting. But that was not controllable on my part. So yeah, it was just a matter of not only Dr. Weil, but both of my advisors said your scope is way too broad. Who's the most important of that group? And it had to be Madison.
Okay, join me in thanking our speakers.